It's great to meet you, actually. And thank you for my introduction. So I'm actually very excited to be able to come here and talk to you about immigration in Korea. So as you see in my title slide, I want to talk to you about immigration in general, but also I want to talk about three broad themes specifically. So let me just begin right ahead. I'm just going to begin with the talk right ahead. And so the first topic that I want to talk to you about is overall kind of policy strategy that the Korean government took in terms of immigration. And I know it could take weeks for me to actually explain all details of immigration policy, but I want to focus on Korean government's strategy to address domestic needs, actually two strands of needs, and how they kind of created categories of visas to accommodate these domestic needs. So I'll talk about that specifically. And then the second theme I want to talk about is, after having learned about Korean incorporation policy in general, I want to talk a little bit about how Native Koreans' citizen attitudes toward immigration has changed over time. And this is important because when immigration policy is set, it not only affects the immigrants who are coming to reside in Korea, but it also affects Korean natives' perspective about this phenomenon. And the EAI actually has done multi-year surveys every 5 years regarding this. And so I'm going to show you the most recent 2020 data and compare it to earlier years of data and show you the trajectory and change in attitude. And then the final third theme that I would like to talk about is my own research about, given then the immigration policy, given then the Native Korean attitude toward immigration, I want us to think about how this may affect the immigrants themselves. And specifically, I did some research on the adjustment of children from multi-ethnic families. Multi-ethnic families would be marriage between a Korean and a foreigner, non-Korean. And so there are quite a few of that. There's quite a bit of international marriages occurring in Korea, and I'll talk about that more so. But anyways, I wanted to show you how their children's educational outcomes as well as psychological outcomes look like in terms of Korea, and maybe compare it to what you would expect to see in more Western multicultural contexts. Okay, so let me move right on. Just as an introduction, I want to give you, this is just a graph that you could find off of the website of the Korean Office of Statistics. Maybe you already know these numbers. So the number of foreigners residing in Korea every year has been increasing, not surprisingly. Currently, by December 2019, roughly 2.5 million foreigners were residing in Korea. That's about a little less than 5% of total population in Korea. I know for those of you who are coming from very international, multicultural countries, like maybe in the Western, especially in the Western hemisphere, you might feel like this percentage is very small. However, you need to take into consideration that Korea used to be a very homogenous society for a long time. And the rate in increase of the foreigners is considered to be for us quite rapid. And we're feeling the impacts of immigration more and more so now than maybe 20, 30 years ago. Another attribute I want to, that I show in this slide is the country of origin of these foreigners. So when we talk about immigration in Korea, it's usually going to be about Asian immigrants because that's about 87% of total immigration. The second largest group is North America, about 7%, and then the third would be Europe. So for Koreans, especially from the state perspective, when we think about immigration, really we're talking about immigrants from China and Southeast Asia, like Vietnamese, Filipinos, Thailand, and et cetera, et cetera. This is I think, an interesting graph for you, probably if you didn't know these statistics. This is the percentage of international marriages. We call them also / multi-ethnic marriages in South Korea. So this would be a marriage between a Korean citizen, ethnic, versus, and an international foreigner. Now, if you look in the beginning of the graph, it's 1993. Less than 2% of total marriages in Korea were international, multi-ethnic. But by 2005, you can see that more than 13% of all marriages in Korea becomes multi-ethnic. Now, I don't have much time to explain to you the very details of this, but for those of you who know, in the early 1990s, international marriages began and kind of was encouraged by the government because there was a lack of Korean brides for specifically rural men. Most of them were farmers, and they were having difficulty finding Korean brides. And so a lot of these foreign brides were imported in some sense to become their wives and bear children and serve the traditional Korean role. But however, now no longer is it limited to rural Korea. Now this phenomenon of multi-ethnic marriages is found all over, a lot in urban areas now. And if you look at the percentage, urban is actually higher than rural. But the point is that once international marriages began, it really increased at a fast rate. And all the way in 2019, you're going to see that about 1 out of every 10 marriages in Korea is multi-ethnic. Okay, so I'm going to move. One other important point here is, so the black solid line is total marriage, right? The red dotted line, look at that. That's the rate of a Korean husband with a foreign wife. So this graph shows you that about 70 to 80% of these multi-ethnic marriages are actually for a foreign bride coming to marry a Korean man. And so it really relates to the policies we have for marriage migrants, because about 80% of marriage migrant visas are issued to females. And so that means when the government talks about marriage migration, we're really talking about female brides coming from foreign countries to marry Korean men. Okay, moving on. I don't have time to actually read through all of the history of immigration, so I'm going to try to just lay out what I wanted to say in terms of immigration. So if you, for those of you who are interested in this, because I know a lot of your students, if you start studying Korean immigration policy, you're going to notice immediately that Korea has some characteristics. And the first point that I want to raise is that Korean government has a two-track system for skilled labor versus unskilled labor. And this is not just unique to Korea. A lot of countries actually do this. I mean, not surprisingly, a lot of nations and governments try to encourage professional skilled labor to come and migrate to their countries, whereas they try to control and restrict unskilled labor to manage it in a way where, not too many come at all at the same time. And so Korea also follows that kind of differentiated immigration policy. But what is really interesting in Korea's case regarding labor migration is that it concentrated heavily on inducing co-ethnics to come to Korea. So that's a little bit of difference across, from maybe European or American countries. So what I mean by co-ethnics is, so there were a lot of Korean ethnics who themselves or their parents or earlier generations migrated to another country, and therefore their citizenship is not Korean, yet ethnically they are. And so Korean government tried to induce migration of these co-ethnics, both being skilled or unskilled, didn't matter, to come back as foreign labor to Korea. And so that's one track of immigration policy that you see in the Korean system. And then the second characteristic that's interesting to Korea is the fact that Korea has a specific policy for marriage migration. And I kind of just explained to you, this marriage migration policy track is kind of unique. It's gender biased because it's unique to female brides coming to Korea. So that's kind of the overview. And if I kind of go through this slide that you see, the first then immigration policy that was set in place in Korea was called the Industrial Technical Training Program System, Industrial Training Program, ITTP. This was for unskilled labor, and the purpose of this was to serve short-term demand, and therefore their legal stay was only 1 year. But you can imagine this was a short time period. It ended up inducing a lot of these unskilled labor to become illegal workers, and it had a lot of problems. And so what happened was in 2004, the government introduced a new program called the Employment Permit System, where unskilled labor had longer, they had 3 years of time period to stay, and then they could renew it. Also, they were guaranteed standard labor rights. And so that's kind of the history of labor policy. Moving on to marriage migration, by 2006, you just saw in the earlier slide, 2005, we had about 13% of international marriages occurring. And so the following year, the government recognized they needed a law, some kind of policy support, some kind of policy to support this population. And as a result, a bunch of acts were passed. And it's really interesting because these acts were passed to to kind of smooth the incorporation of these foreign female migrants. To sum up, so I know I laid a lot of information to you just now. So to sum up, if you look at the final phrase here, the Korean state has differentiated incorporation policies to migrants, like I said, and that led to a growth of multiple visa categories, not surprisingly. And the state's selective response, it wasn't random. It was actually very strategic to meet domestic labor demands, as well as demographic pressures. So the domestic labor demands relates to, like I said earlier, the labor shortages, especially in manufacturing and service industries. And Korean government utilized the immigration of co-ethnic workers in this strategy. So today, I'm going to talk to you, give you a little bit more detail about the co-ethnic visa policy. And then secondly, the demographic pressures were addressed by encouraging incorporation of female marriage migrants. Got it. Okay, moving on. This is just the types of visa categories that exist in Korea. I couldn't put down every single one, so I limited to visa categories that had at least 2% or more. You can maybe view this slide more carefully. I just want to point out that in this talk, I'm going to focus on two types of visas. One, the co-ethnic visas, two, the marriage migrant visas. The co-ethnic visas are two kinds here, the overseas Korean F4, the green one here, and the H2 working visit visa, which would be the dark gray here. These two are only for co-ethnics, but it's interesting, you might be wondering, why do they have two types of visa for co-ethnics when they could just have given the same one to everyone? Well, that is again related to Korea's strategy of trying to differentiate skilled and unskilled labor and etc. So we're going to talk about the difference between these two and compare it to other types of visas. And then I want to talk to you about marriage migrant visa, which is the purple. It's about 5% of all visas, but again, this was 82% or 81% of them are all females. Okay, moving on. Now, so the overseas Korean visa, F4, that I just showed you, that was the green line here, which had about more than 18%, okay? So the overseas F4 visa was introduced because in 1999, the Korean state proposes the purpose of this, the Overseas Act, was to create a global Korean community. And the real target for the F4 visas were US Korean Americans. And that was because it was believed that these US Korean Americans could bring in English-speaking professionals to Korea, as well as foreign capital. That was much needed at the time following the financial crisis of 1997 and 1998. However, the problem was at the time, the largest group of co-ethnic immigrants in Korea weren't US Americans. It was actually co-ethnics from China. But under the F4 visa, immigrants from China and the former Soviet Union were not eligible because of this clause that said they had to have left Korean Peninsula after the founding of the Republic of Korea in 1948. The problem here is that a lot of the migrants that went to China and former Soviet Union left during the colonization period of Korea. And Korea was emancipated in 1945. So a lot of them had left much earlier than 1948. So this was discriminatory, and this provision was lifted later. But still, you can kind of see that the creation of the F4 was more targeted towards skilled labor, skilled co-ethnics. And therefore, the government in 2007 created a new visa category called the H2 working visit visa. And it was exclusively for Koreans from China and Soviet Union. Now, the thing here is then, when you think about the H2 working visit visa, it's quite different from the F4 in that the F4 visa immigrants were prohibited from working in manual labor. And so this, again, was more of a skilled type of visa for co-ethnics. The H2 working visa was an unskilled visa for co-ethnics. And if you compare that to just regular unskilled visa that foreigners get that are not co-ethnic, the E9 visas, the H2 did get some preferential treatment. And this table kind of explains the difference in treatment across these three groups of three groups of visa categories. So if you see here at the top, the overseas Korean visa, Like I explained all of this, but the associated rights is quite expansive. They have property rights, investment rights, all sorts of insurance eligibilities and whatnot. And the duration is 30 years, but they can renew it continuously. There's no restriction to this. On the other hand, the visa for ethnic Koreans from China and the USSR, for them, the duration is they're limited in terms of renewal. So they can only renew their visa once. However, employment restriction, they don't have any. Their rights are limited to just labor rights that Korean laborers would get by the law. And so they don't really have property rights or investment rights like the earlier group. However, if you compare them to just regular unskilled immigrants, then they have much more freedom in their employment, because if you come through a E9 unskilled visa in Korea, then you have restrictions in terms of your industry and change in employment, which is quite restrictive in a lot of ways. And so so just in a nutshell, when you think about the labor categories in Korea, you could classify basically that the overseas Korean F4 visa would be the top. And right below that would be H2 working visit for the unskilled co-ethnics. And then really at the bottom would be the unskilled E9 for the rest of the foreigners who are not co-ethnics. So that would be kind of the treatment. Now, next, moving to the marriage migrant visas. Like I said, since 2005, Korea has been, having serious fertility issues, and we are known as one of the fastest aging populations in the world, unfortunately. And under this circumstance, the Korean government actually viewed marriage migrants as kind of helping to solve this problem, because again, marriage migrants were predominantly females, and they were coming to marry Korean men and have Korean children. And so as a result, in 2011, the marriage migrant visa, F6 visa, was created. And the treatment of the F6 visa was comparable to the high-skilled professional visas and the overseas Korean visas. So their treatment was much better than co-ethnics from China or the former Soviet Union. That's kind of an interesting attribute here. However, even though they got very good treatment in terms of an immigration policy, by being labeled as a marriage migrant in Korea, and based on the fact that they were serving the traditional Korean woman's role as a mother and as a daughter-in-law, and as a wife, they had the idea of their role of bearing Korean children, caring for their Asian Korean in-laws and becoming Korean citizens. And this is all kind of towards assimilating towards the Korean culture. It was really strong. And so marriage migrants who failed to follow this role would probably, you can imagine, not having easy time here in the society. And so this is the visa category, again, the same table, but the bottom row here describes the rights and treatments of female of the marriage migrants, predominantly female. Notice here that they, again, have no employment restrictions, just like the co-ethnic H2 visas, but their associated rights is expansive enough, just like the overseas Korean visas. And the duration, again, is they have no restriction in renewal. They can renew it every time. And so among all visa categories, the marriage migrant visa category is, in some sense, the best in terms of treatment. They get the most preferential treatment from the Korean government. And then you can imagine the unskilled labor category would be the treatment is much worse compared to the rest of the groups. Now, okay, so this is the last slide for the policy. I know I threw a lot of information at you, and I was speaking at a very fast pace. But to sum it up, Korean government, like I said, has differentiated policy tracks for skilled, unskilled labor, even among co-ethnics. And they give the best treatment to marriage migrants because these migrants are considered to be serving quite an important role in regard to Korean demographics, the change in Korean demographics. Okay, so moving on then, I want to show you some survey results regarding Korean citizen attitudes toward multiculturalism and immigration in general. So this survey that I talked about earlier is conducted by the East Asian Institute, and it has been occurring since 2005. Now, the first question survey result I want to show you is about when they asked to Native Koreans. It's a random sample of Native Koreans. Do you think Korea should be a mono-ethnic and a monocultural country, or do you think it should be a multi-ethnic, multicultural country? They asked this question. And the survey reply, let's look at the graph here. So those of the people who answered, I think Korea should remain a mono-ethnic, monocultural society was around 37, 39% in years 2010, 15, and 20. So what this indicates to me is about a little less than 40% of Koreans wanted to be, a mono-ethnic country. But this ratio hasn't changed in the past 10 years. What's interesting here is the multi-ethnic category. So in 2010, more than half, 60% of Koreans said, I think Korea should become a multicultural society. So this is very optimistic when you consider a Korean attitude. And I want you to go back to what I showed you about policy change. If you recall, the first policy for multicultural families for marriage migrants occurred in 2006 and 2008. This is a period where rapidly international marriages were growing, and the frame, kind of the dominant frame regarding immigrants in Korea was about marriage migrants and how they're coming to help Korean society in many ways, kind of serving the traditional role. And so the Korean citizens' perspective of immigrants at the time was actually quite paternalistic, if you would say, and it was definitely more positive. And so they were open to this concept of foreigners coming in to help Korea. However, with time, by 2015 and 20, the idea of Koreans wanting a multicultural society has dropped a lot. And so by 2020, only 44% of Koreans say they want a multicultural society. Now, this drop is not linked to an increase in their preference towards monocultural. Rather, it's due to the increase in people who have become uncertain. So a lot of people are now saying, I'm not really sure, I don't know. And so kind of that's an interesting change. Now, I want us to look at the table that I show you here. And so this is a survey question of the following questions. The following statements, asking people, do you agree or, do you disagree? And so if you look here, I'm actually, sorry, I can't see the full slide, sorry. Oh, okay, great. Okay, so the first, we have 5 statements here. And you can see the first statement is, racial, religious, cultural diversity enhances national competitiveness. Having more immigrants enriches Korea's culture. There are limitations to receiving foreigners. Foreigners should come and assimilate to Korean society by abandoning culture and habits. And then finally, we should provide equal voting rights and social security benefits to naturalized citizens. So these are the 5 statements, and I'm just going to show you the results right here. It's really interesting because if you look at the results, you're going to see that the idea that the proportion of Korean natives who are, acknowledging the positive side of multiculturalism by saying competitiveness has increased and it enriches culture has actually increased over the 3 years. So the solid black line is 2020. So it's gotten higher. But again, there's also some negative attitude that has increased over the over the decade, actually, over the 3 survey periods, which is more people are saying that there are immigrations have limitations. There are also more people saying that they think foreigners should abandon their own culture and assimilate to Korean culture. And there are also less Koreans who are saying, let's give more benefits to naturalized citizens. So if you kind of combine these results together, it seems that the attitude toward immigration in Korea is becoming not uniform, but multifaceted. It seems that Koreans are becoming more open to immigrants from a cultural perspective, but they are becoming more worrisome about immigration at the same time regarding kind of economic, materialistic attributes, as well as institutional dimensions. And materialistic kind of attributes may include, competition of jobs, increased taxes because due to, more self-welfare spending and et cetera, things like that. This is a table that kind of just shows you very similar results from the earlier slide, where The red comments are the comments where over the 15 years, we see an increase in positive attitude towards immigration, where more people are saying, Korea is a good country for foreigners to reside in. Also, over the time, we've seen that people are less likely to oppose their child marrying a foreigner, so they're more open to international marriages. And we also find that people don't believe now, less and less, they're believing that immigration leads to more crime. So these things are changes, positive changes, and becoming more open to multiculturalism. But at the same time, there are also negative attitudes increasing. Let me show you here. So more and more people are saying that they feel different toward foreigners depending on their country of origin. And Korea has been known to have differences in attitude based on country of origin, where they're more welcoming to foreigners from developed countries, but less welcoming to foreigners from developing countries. And so this type of dual ethnic bias, we call it, this dual ethnic bias has gotten worse over time. Again, Koreans are more likely to say that the jobs of Koreans are being threatened by foreigners over time. Past 15 years has increased. And finally, less and less people are agreeing to the idea that we should make it easier for foreigners to obtain citizenship. And so, like I said, in a nutshell, I guess, comparing these kind of changes over time, you can see that the multifaceted attitude really kind of is different in that Koreans tend to display growing acceptance and tolerance on issues relating to cultural benefits of multiculturalism and international marriages. However, their attitudes are becoming more exclusionary on things that pose real economic threats, such as, competing for jobs, benefits, and social services. So this is a very complicated picture that I'm showing you. And so this is, a lot of scholars are analyzing this as Koreans becoming, they're no longer naive about immigration because it's been going on for, more than a decade now, for several decades. And now they're actually kind of showing attributes that are, I think, quite commonly seen in European or other countries that have large immigrations. Okay, the next graph I want to show you is about Korean feelings of closeness by different immigrant groups. So if you see here, the dotted blue is 2010, dotted red 2015, black solid is 2020. You can see that across all 5 groups, which are North Korean defectors, labor migrants, marriage migrants, children of multi-ethnic marriages, and then finally Chinese Korean co-ethnics from China, so Korean Chinese. If you look across all 5 groups, you're going to see that across these 3 survey periods, so over the 10-year period, Korean closeness, feelings of closeness has dropped significantly. And so this means that Korean natives are feeling less and less close to these groups. And in terms of, if you see the ordering, you see that the Koreans tend to feel the greatest affinity toward children of international couples, followed by North Korean defectors, marriage migrants, Korean Chinese, and labor markets. So Koreans tend to feel closer to native Koreans, co-ethnics, when they have a bloodline, common bloodline, and then if you have a potential to compete for scarce resources like the labor migrants, affinity is the least. So you see that. Okay, now a lot of time has passed, so this is the third theme that I wanted to talk to you about, showing you my study on exploring the acculturation profiles and adaptation of children of, again, these international marriages by marriage migrants. Okay. So the conceptual framework here is based on 2 theories. And the first is called the Berry's model, where immigrant youth, so Berry, this very famous scholar Berry, hypothesized and actually proved that immigrant youth acculturation strategy is really determined by 2 main factors. And one is how much this immigrant youth maintains the culture of heritage. In this case, for marriage migrants, the children, it would be the mother's heritage. And the degree to which, how much they embrace the host culture. In this case, how much they embrace the Korean culture. Now, when you think about multi-ethnic children in Korea, it's unique because generally in Western contexts or other contexts, immigrant families migrate as a family unit. And so there is really no mixed race. It's like all Mexicans or all, all Chinese, all Koreans. But in the multi-ethnic children case, this is a mixed race couple where the migrant comes from a different country to the Korean society. So just keeping that in mind, still, I'm going to try to see how Korean ethnic children, multi-ethnic children, how much of them maintain their mother's heritage culture, as well as how much of them are really embraced in the Korean culture. And based on these 4 degrees of, acculturation, Berry said that immigrant youth generally fall into one of the 4 categories, which is the assimilation category, integration, separation, and marginalization. Just to briefly explain, the assimilation category would mean a child abandons the culture of heritage, in this case, the mother's culture, but embraces the host culture. And so completely becomes Korean and avoids or doesn't really relate any to the mother's heritage. The integration category would be the case where they embrace both cultures. Okay. The separation would be when the child only embraces the mother's heritage, but abandons Korean culture. And the final marginalization category would be the case where the child is not really adjusted in any culture, and so is really marginalized. Now, in general, there's actually a lot of research done about acculturation. So if you are interested, just type acculturation, Google Scholar, you'll find a lot. In general, a lot of these studies have been done in a Western context. And so these are multicultural countries, right? So in general, the largest category group that scholars find is the integration group. And so in general, children of these, multi-ethnic kind of families generally they tend to embrace both cultures. And generally, the integration group has the best outcomes in terms of education, labor market outcomes, etc. And the marginalization group has the worst outcomes, which is not too surprising. Okay. Now, the second theory I wanted to kind of explain a little bit about is the segmented assimilation theory, which is, again, looking at second-generation immigrants, and says that immigrant youth outcome is determined by the context of reception. And context of reception here includes 3 main factors. First is the policy of the host government, which in case is Korea's government. Second is the attitude of the native population. We just examined both of these. And the third is the size and I guess the power of the co-ethnic community that exists in this host society. Now, if we talk about the context of reception in Korea, we just talked about Korean government for marriage migrants here, right? If you remember, they're actually given a lot of benefits compared to other migrants. But I told you a lot of these benefits are kind of encouraging the woman and the children to become Korean, meaning assimilate to Korean society, to kind of learn Korean language, learn the culture, become a Korean model citizen. And so the assimilation type of strategy that the Korean government policy has for children, these children, is, I think, very important in how it influences their acculturation. Secondly, the attitude of native Koreans toward migrants is, like I said earlier, they're known to have a dual ethnic bias. And so generally, they're more sympathetic toward foreigners from advanced, developed nations, but a lot of antagonistic attitude toward ethnic minorities from less developed countries have been reported in Korea over and over. And lastly, the size of the co-ethnic community is considered to be important in Western context because it's supposed to provide some kind of buffer for these immigrant families, by helping them find jobs or, encourage their incorporation into society. But in Korea's context, this is less of a factor because the immigrant population is still very small compared to the total population. And it's not just immigrant population, but we're talking about co-ethnics. So, for example, the same race from the same country type of community that really buffers these immigrants. So this is really small when you look at it by co-ethnic community. And so overall, the South Korean context of reception appears to be very different from the Western context. And in fact, I set 3 distinct hypotheses because of the difference in reception of context of reception, sorry. So the first hypothesis was, if you recall, the separation profile, which is the profile in this case that would only embrace the mother's heritage culture, but avoid and abandoned Korean culture. So the hypothesis here was the separation profile probably is very small in Korea, or maybe it doesn't even exist, because it would be very hard for the child to survive in this context if you're abandoning Korean culture and only embracing the mother's culture when all of your family, except for your mother, is Korean and you're born and raised in Korea. And so the separation profile in Korea would probably be very small. Second hypothesis is that the positive effects of the integration strategy may not be as strong as for Korean multi-ethnics as compared to the Western context, because generally the reason integration strategy is very positive, has positive outcomes, is because they can draw on resources from both cultures, and it's very useful in a multicultural society. But because Korea is, as I just told you, has a very strong assimilation kind of policy towards these families, maybe, being able to embrace both culture is not affiliated with such, positive outcomes. And then the third hypothesis I set was acculturation profiles may vary across maternal ethnicity. And I actually thought probably children with a mother or, with a mother from developed nation may be adjusting a little better than children from developing countries. Who knows? But it was worth exploring because of this strong dual ethnic bias going on. So these were the three hypotheses that I wanted to test. And using data, it's a nationally representative data of children from multi-ethnic marriages. I first classified youth into different acculturation profiles by using a method called latent class latent class analysis. I'm not going to talk about the method here. You can study that later. But basically, I categorized youth into acculturation categories, like profiles, using 7 items, but basically 3 important variables: looking at their language proficiency, looking at the desire to maintain and learn about their mother's heritage culture, and finally, how much they identify to their to their mother's native culture. And so the result here was very interesting because the results revealed that Korean multi-ethnic youth could be classified into 4 distinct profiles, clusters. The largest profile was cluster 1, and I labeled them as assimilated cluster. So these are children that looked to me had assimilated to the Korean society and had very little kind of embracement of their mother's heritage culture. Look, so this is about 42% of youth, and you can see that their Korean language proficiency is almost perfect, but almost none of them can speak or understand their mother's language. Their desire to learn about their mother's language is very low. It's about about only 30%. And their interest in learning about their mother's native country is also very low. They're also not proud of others finding out that their mother is a foreigner. So this group of Koreans who are multi-ethnic seem to be completely assimilated to be actually just Koreans. The second cluster comprises about 38% of the sample. It's also a very large cluster, but they're very interesting because they are, again, Korean language is perfect for them, but they almost speak no mother language. But the difference here from the assimilated is that they want to learn about their mother's language and heritage culture. So if you see their desire to learn about their mother's language and culture is very strong. And they're actually proud of others finding out that their mother is a foreigner. So these two groups look very similar in their language. So they're linguistically assimilated, but they're very different in identity and, kind of maintaining pride in their mother's heritage culture. And so I call them psychologically diffused. What it means is that they lack, so they have this desire to learn about their mother's heritage culture, yet they lack the means because they don't speak the language. So they're a little bit diffused in this kind of attribute. The third cluster is integrated. And like I said, if you look at Western data sets, this cluster is usually the largest. But in Korea, only 13% of the sample is integrated. And again, both of these groups speak both the mother's language and Korean language really well. And their desire to learn about their mother's culture is pretty high. So this is kind of like the best group, if you would say. They're doing well in terms of both cultures. The final cluster 4 is the marginalized. This is a really sad group. It's about 7% of the sample, where They don't speak the Korean language despite being born and raised in Korea. They speak a little bit of their mother's language, but not really well. And they're not really, showing much interest or pride in their mother's heritage culture. So this is a very disadvantaged cluster because they can't draw resources from either culture. It's definitely a cluster that government policy should be worried about. Okay, so this is just a summary of what I explained very carefully. To give you a little more detail about the characteristics of youth by clusters. So if you look at maternal ethnicity, if you recall, cluster 1 was the assimilated group. So the assimilated children's mothers are generally Chinese, Chinese Korean, and other Asian. So these are the typical marriage migrant groups. The cluster 2, if you recall, these were the kids that spoke Korean perfectly. They didn't speak mother tongue, but they wanted to learn about it. They were predominantly Japanese. Very interesting. Cluster 3 was the integrated. A lot of them were more likely to be Japanese and North American and European. Finally, cluster 4 was the marginalized, not doing really well. Again, they were Japanese and other Asian countries. Mother's education level is also very different. If you look here, cluster 1, the assimilated group, have lower maternal education level than the other clusters. And cluster 2 and 3 have higher maternal education levels. Actually, marginalized group also has low education level for their mothers. It's not too surprising here. Finally, I wanted to show you quality of parent-child relationship for these clusters. So if you notice, the parent-child relationship is lowest for the marginalized group, not too surprising. But the funny thing is the highest satisfaction generally comes from the two groups of cluster 2 and 3, which is the integrated group and the group that is linguistically assimilated but psychologically diffused. And the assimilated group has, just, I would say, average maternal and paternal relationship results. Okay, so this is the final result for the study, which is showing you right now across these 4 clusters. How are they doing in terms of expressing difficulty in school, in terms of saying that, I want to go to a 4-year college, showing high educational aspiration, and finally, in terms of saying that, they have depressive symptoms, and showing depressive symptoms. So this is a logistic regression. So to interpret this, you need to compare the results against the omitted group, which is cluster 1. So I'll just interpret this for you. So the diffused group, if you recall, cluster 2 is less likely to say that they have no difficulty in school compared to the assimilated group. So what this means is that the diffused group are having more difficulty in school than the completely assimilated group, cluster 1. But they're not more likely to say they have more depressive symptoms, or they're not, they're not less likely to have high educational aspirations. Cluster 3, if you recall, was the integrated group. So this means that the integrated group is not different from the assimilated group across all 3 outcomes. This is a difference from the Western studies, because remember, integrated groups are known to be showing higher outcomes than the assimilated group in general for multicultural Western societies. But we don't see that in Korea. Rather, it seems that they're doing basically the same than as the assimilated groups. And then cluster 4 is the marginalized group, and they are doing actually much worse off than the assimilated group. They're much more likely to show depressive symptoms. They're much more likely to say they're having difficulty at school, and they're much less likely to have high educational aspirations. So this is definitely a group that we should be worried about. And so all 3 hypotheses, if you recall, are actually accepted, because if you see in the clusters, we don't really have a separation profile. So there's no group of children in Korea that refuses the Korean language and the Korean culture and only takes on the mother's language and the mother's culture. And probably that's because of the uniqueness of marriage migrants. Hypothesis 2 about integration profile not showing as strong positive effects than the other assimilated profile was again true in Korea. Also, and then hypothesis 3, which is acculturation profiles, varies across maternal ethnicity. You kind of saw that in the earlier table, where assimilated and marginalized clusters have a larger fraction of mothers from Asian countries. So that was accepted. And so I'm going to kind of conclude here. This is the references I used for today's presentation, and I'll give you a chance to ask me questions. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Has the recent success in the spread of Korean culture around the world positively or negatively affected the visibility of foreigners within Korean society? Well, okay, I guess the spread of I guess you're talking about K-pop and K-dramas. I'm not sure how that would have affected the visibility of foreigners in Korea. What I see though is, if you notice in Korean media, we have more and more foreigners appearing on Korean TV. Have you noticed that? And so that served a role in changing Korean attitude toward foreigners, because before foreigners were on TV this way, a lot of Koreans thought, when they immediately thought of foreigners, they thought of illegal migrant workers, or migrant workers who are unskilled, or they thought of marriage migrants who were maybe abused by their Korean husband, or they were having difficulty, and they were like kind of sad images of foreigners. But because of this shift in the media, the influence of media is enormous. Now Koreans perceive foreigners to be a much more diverse group than earlier. So I can say that. The next question. South Korea is referred to as a baby exporter country. Yes, we have, you're talking about adoption rates. I know that. Okay, so I'm given to understand that most Korean people are unwilling to adopt a baby due to so-called different bloodlines. What is the government doing to tackle this issue? So I'll give you some facts about adoption. So currently in Korea, babies, I guess, children who are below the age of 1 are almost, unless they have a disability, the adoption rate for them is almost close to 0. So there's a waiting list to adopt very young children. So the kids who are being exported to these Western countries are generally kids that are older, who come into the foster system at a much older age, or who have disabilities. And so the adoption rate of very young children have drastically dropped in Korea. That's one change. Now, the Korean government regarding adoption, I guess it's beyond the scope of this talk, but laws have been changing, and so there's a lot more protection for these adoptions. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, the question. For someone whose parents are both foreigners, but he or she was born, raised, and educated in Korea, do they qualify to be a Korean citizen? No, no. That's the way I know it. So the thing is, in order for you to obtain Korean citizenship, you automatically obtain it if either one of your parents hold a Korean citizenship and you're considered a co-ethnic. You have that bloodline. Just by being born and raised here, for example, like if your parents are illegal immigrants in Korea, illegal workers, you're born in Korea, you're raised here, you don't get automatic citizenship like you would in the US. So citizenship is not given by birth in this country. Okay. There are issues about marriage agents who are buying wives for Korean men. Yes. How do you consider their assimilation to Korean culture, since the divorce rate is very high? So that is future. See, I didn't have time to really talk about this, but you're right. So the history of marriage migration is very, I guess, complicated, because in the early years, if you recall the graph, in the 1990s, when marriage migration first began, it was somewhat encouraged by the government, because this started, like I said, to solve the issue of lack of brides for rural Korean men, right? And so the Korean local government actually encouraged these brokers to introduce Korean men foreign brides. But because of this kind of encouragement without the appropriate regulations, there was a lot of side effect. And one of these side effects was, like you said here, it was divorce, high divorce rate, domestic violence issues, all sorts of problems emerged. And as a result, the Korean government has been putting more and more, I guess, restrictions toward qualification of immigrants, especially in the Vietnamese case. You have to pass a Korean language test to obtain the marriage migrant visa. But there are side effects to this too, because you can't really stop a Korean citizen from marrying someone, right? But you can stop them from getting a visa. That's all the government can do. So a lot of the side effect was Koreans continued to marry Vietnamese women, but because their visa was not issued because these Vietnamese women couldn't speak Korean enough, they ended up just being separated, if you know what I mean. So the woman remained in Vietnam and the men would come back to Korea. And so it just produced a lot of problems. So in terms of preventing domestic violence, this language test, I don't think is doing a great job. But if you think about other aspects where in the marriage migration visa table, if you go back to my earlier presentation, there are 3 ways of obtaining marriage migrant visa. And it used to be only one way. It used to be only one way, which was you're married to your husband and your husband agrees to be your sponsor. But the problem with that is the woman could be abused because of this constraint, right? Because even if she was abused, she was afraid to divorce him because then she couldn't get her visa. But the Korean law was amended to acknowledge that she could get her visa either as a wife or as a mother of a Korean child, or as a divorcee, especially under these cases of domestic violence. And so these policies have been revised because of the problems that were acknowledged. Okay, is there a follow-up question? Slightly off tangent, but what is the main reason that this certain group lack women to marry locally? Oh, that's a very good question, actually. It's not off tangent. It's because it's related to Korea's rapid economic development, because a lot of people left the rural area to come to urban spaces, and not just unique to Korea. Urbanization was rapidly occurring. And women tend to leave the rural area faster than men. And this is also not unique to Korea. So women would come to urban areas more so. And the young men who were farmers there kind of didn't have any appropriate Korean bride. And so that's how it started in the very beginning. I hope that answers your question. Now, why has the proportion of Koreans who want their country to be multicultural decreased since 2010? What discouraged them? This is sad, especially since the perception of foreigners among Koreans has improved. Yeah. You know what? I've been giving this a lot of thought too. And the reason that I've been able to come up with through the readings is that, like I said earlier, in 2010, like the high rate of approval, about 60%, I think is abnormal. It's abnormal because Koreans at the time didn't really know what multiculturalism meant or is. Because you got to remember, the history of increased immigration for Korea is very short compared to other countries. And so at the time, if you read the newspapers at the time, multiculturalism was kind of boosted by government. It was a top-down approach. It was not kind of shared and embraced by having a neighbor who's a foreigner or having a friend who's a foreigner. Rather, there was a very small fraction of foreigners in Korea, but the government propaganda was about, we should embrace female marriage migrants who are coming to our society, to bear Korean children. They're serving the Korean traditional role. Also, these poor labor migrants are getting abused by Korean, factory owners, and we need to, give them more rights. So this kind of language was really paternalistic. The majority of Korean people at the time, I don't think really understood what it meant to have more immigration. And so I think we see that there's a downward trend in people wanting multiculturalism, but rather than just saying that, very simplistically, this is a negative thing, I think people are getting smarter. So I think they're thinking, multiculturalism is a very important yet complicated thing. We need to view this in many different aspects and consider immigration for everything that it is. I think in the 2010 year period, it was a government top-down propaganda, and people really didn't understand what it meant for them. I think that's what the scholars and experts are arguing, and I kind of agree with that. Okay, so do ethnic Koreans, particularly those coming from former Soviet republics, assimilate into the Korean society? From my observation, they mostly reside in Russian districts that are an equivalent of Chinatown and have problems with language learning integration. What is the government's policy towards that? Yeah, this is a very important question. So if you think about assimilation, so you remember in the talk I said, Korean government provides a lot of services for marriage migrants, and this is including marriage migrants from the USSR. So there's actually a lot of assimilation programs for marriage migrants, like about, teaching them Korean language, teaching them how to cook Korean food, teaching them about Korean culture, and etc. But there aren't that many government-sponsored programs for foreign laborers. A lot of the programs for foreign laborers are coming from nonprofit organization. It's not directly provided and managed like it is for marriage migrants. And so that's why I said preferential treatment here is the word for marriage migrants. And a lot of effort and money is spent towards assimilating them, but much less so for labor migrants. Do you understand? And so that's why when you say you see a lot of, immigrants from these USSR countries, I want to ask you, probably they're migrant workers, they're laborers. They're not probably marriage migrants, because if they were, they would probably be getting a lot of support in learning the culture and assimilating. I wonder if that answers your question, but yeah. Oh, there's another question. Those Korean culture victories abroad, wouldn't they encourage the idea that whoever is in Korea should learn and adapt to Korean culture, because this gives a sense of Korean culture being superior to Oh, I guess you're saying because Korean culture is now so popular in the world, maybe assimilation should be the propaganda. I guess that's your question. I disagree, but that's my personal opinion. The reason I disagree is I think imposing or encouraging too much of an assimilation perspective to foreigners, it could have a side effect. And also when you think about especially the children of these, like the second generation immigrants coming from this assimilation approach, I don't necessarily think it would produce positive outcomes, because the research in all parts of the world are suggesting that in order to encouraging children and families to embrace these differences in culture and be able to, draw resources and be able to kind of function in both cultures is better than kind of imposing just one culture altogether. But that's my personal opinion. That's me. Okay, Victoria, what is the impact of an economic slowdown on immigration, especially in the context of COVID-19, Korea's overeducation, underemployment, and unemployment? That's a very good question. You know what? Honestly, the impact of economic slowdown, you have to think of it in terms of the type of labor, I think. So remember, Korea is very open to bringing in high-skilled labor, the type of labor that they need. So if you think about COVID-19, I would bet you right now area of expertise that Korea would die for would be related to ICT, technology, about AI, things that are related to the fourth industrial revolution. I bet it would be much easier to come to Korea now. Regarding unskilled labor, with COVID-19, there have been a lot of media reports that a lot of the labor migrants were sent back home, and so Korean industry is suffering because of lack of labor for these specific manufacturing service industries and farming and etc. And so it is I guess the COVID-19 in the future will definitely affect the type of immigration that occurs and how it affects Korean society. But I don't think it will be uniform. I think it will really be based on demand and the future needs. Okay. How do South Koreans perceive ethnic Koreans as foreigners or fellow Koreans? Does the perception differ depending on age of population? Yeah, that's a very good question. So there have been some studies about how Koreans perceive ethnic. Remember the graph of the feelings of closeness? So the Korean Chinese are the ethnic Koreans, actually. So these are ethnic Koreans who are Chinese citizens, but coming to Korea to work. And really, surprisingly, the feeling of closeness for them used to be very high, but it's been dropping over the past 10 years. And so I think more and more Koreans are feeling that they're actually more Chinese than Korean, based on the statistics. And so depending on the age of population, I haven't actually looked at that, but that's a good question. But overall, in terms of age, we find that the younger generation are definitely more open to multiculturalism, whereas those who are 40 and above seem to be definitely much more kind of conservative in this aspect. Yeah. Okay, you know what? I just heard that we are out of time. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I feel like I rushed things so much. I'm sorry if I talked really fast, but I wanted to give you as much information as possible. Thank you.